This
tells me, Kyle.
conference
So
will now be
we're
recorded.
excited to hear what you have for us. Before we get going, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors. I know some of them are probably on the line here. And the good news is, Barry said we have over 170 registered for today's virtual luncheon, which would be our virtual record. So we appreciate everybody jumping on. If you could please mute your microphones, but keep your videos on. Kyle wants to make sure that he can see that you're actually laughing and that he's funny. So we appreciate keeping the videos on. Yeah. So I'll go through a bio here real quick. Kyle's going to present to us Bombing, the Art of Embracing Failure. Kyle's the owner of the Comedy Bar with locations in Dubuque, Chicago, and Nashville. Um, True success, especially at a younger age, is all about learning from your mistakes. An Ohio native, Kyle started his comedy career in Chicago at the age of 19. Having moved there to pursue a career in dramatic acting, he quickly discovered his passion for stand-up within the vibrant comedy scene in the city. Lane immediately began producing his own shows at local bars and theaters, even taking classes at Second City, a world-renowned school for comedy arts. Today, Lane has opened two additional clubs in Nashville and Dubuque and is working to expand the Comedy Bar brand to other markets within the U.S. In addition to his comedy bar business, Lane is involved in the film industry, having executive produced Dylan, which was featured in the Julian Dubuque International Film Festival in 2018. And this is a big part of the reason the Comedy Bar was introduced to Dubuque. So without further ado, Kyle, we appreciate you coming to speak to us today. We look forward to a few laughs, and I'll let you take it over. Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you, Scott. And, forgive me. It's usually comedy is so much better live. So forgive me if I'm not funny enough here. Typically, I prepare for 45 minutes of laughter and about 5 minutes of material. So it might be the other way here this time. It's good to have Barry here, and I want to thank everybody who helped set this up, and I appreciate everybody moving over to this other option for the formatting for the web. We're having some technical difficulties. So, I'm a young professional like yourselves. You heard a little bit in my bio about my story, but yeah, my name's Kyle Lane, and I've been in the entertainment business since I was about 19 years old, specifically comedy and acting. And I've been lucky enough and humble enough to have a lot of success in it, but it hasn't come without a litany of failures and mistakes. And that's something I want to talk to you a little bit about today, and sort of what we're going to walk through is how much metaphorically what it takes to become a stand-up comedian relates to really everyday life, and what it takes to become a young professional. And we'll get a little bit more into that. But yeah, I started the Comedy Bar about 10 years ago. I was 25 years old, and for me, I was sort of hitting a wall with my performing. And what had happened is the first financial crisis of 2008, 2009 had hit. I was laid off from my hotel job where I was a doorman, and I kind of said, "Man, I'm sort of this is forcing my hand, kind of like the times now." And I said, "I'm gonna start a comedy club." I saw a hole in the market. I had no money. I mean, zero money. And I literally started this entire brand off of the unemployment checks and the government assistance I was receiving when the first financial crisis hit from all my layoffs. And I just think that's such a neat example for how our generation, specifically millennials, have had to navigate and create and build businesses in such difficult times. I have this really interesting breakdown of what exactly our generation has sort of faced and gone through compared to a lot of other generations. I'm just going to read this off because I think it's really, really interesting. So specifically, born between 1980 to the late 1990s is what I'm talking about. So I'm gonna give this list. Almost every home except third world countries has had an internet connection or computer. We faced the largest economic decline since the Great Depression in 2008. The 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The effect of 20 plus years of offshoring of American jobs is we're finally feeling it, what Clinton passed back in the day. Enron, the energy trading scams and corporate fraud on a national level, global warming becoming obvious with unusual severe storms, hot weather, cold weather, more droughts, the Iraq war and Afghanistan war, the explosive growth in online companies such as Google and Facebook that have literally changed the way we communicate and do business across the world. A revolution in the way we work, including widespread excessive flex time, work from home. And then, of course, this next financial crisis that I think hasn't even peaked its head yet, and a pandemic that has completely forced us to lose all our freedoms essentially and have to shut down our businesses. I don't know what a lot of you have gone through, but the Comedy Bar has been shut down since mid-March at all our locations. But because, generationally, I'm typically kind of a younger comedy club owner than most, and everything that we've faced and the creativity that I've had to deal with when it comes to running my business and expanding my business in these crazy times, we've opened all our locations on our patios. And no other competitor that I have that I can think of offhand even has patios or parking lots. So in Chicago and Nashville right now, we are literally the only entertainment in town. The movie theaters aren't open, sporting events aren't open, bars aren't even allowed to be open yet. And so because of the way we've built our model, we've been able to fall into the gray area of the legalities of opening back up with this pandemic restrictions that, we've sold out. We opened up last weekend. We sold out all our shows. We're going again this weekend. It's certainly week by week, but I just think what's most interesting about our generation and the example of the Comedy Bar and how it's had to operate during these creative times is we've faced failure head on. We've had to. I mean, this is the second financial crisis in 10 years. When it comes to our generation and the gap that we're falling in to run our business and to become professionals, this is insane. This is unprecedented times. And if you're not vulnerable and able to navigate and maneuver through the failure, whether it's from your own doing or something like a pandemic that you have absolutely no control over, you will fall by the wayside. There are plenty of businesses shutting down right now, and it is imperative that we sort of understand how to navigate failure and not just get through it, but actually turn it into something very successful for us. So I think that's a really interesting point to make. I would read off Barry's generation, but it just says stay handsome. That's the only thing it says on it. So I'm just kidding, Barry.
Careful.
But the millennial generation has faced quite a bit. So it's certainly interesting how we navigate these times. Now, you may ask, what does comedy exactly have to do with failure? How do they coincide? So it's very interesting because when you learn where comedians pull their material from, comedy comes from trauma. It comes from failure. The responsibility of the comedian is sort of to take their personal trauma or the trauma of the world and articulate it in a way to an audience to where we can talk about these failures, we can laugh about them, we can learn about them together, and we can sort of heal and move on from them. So comedy sort of is in tandem with failure, uh, uh, especially when it comes to stand-up comedy. Um, in fact, there's this really neat study going on to define exactly what comedy is, and what makes us laugh, because it's a very innate social response to laugh, just like crying or anger. And scientists have been studying and doing the research that they can to figure it out. And there's something called a benign violation. So what exactly is a benign violation? Well, for example, uh, uh, let's say you see somebody a stranger walking across the street, and they fall down, they trip and they fall. That's a violation. That's not supposed to happen. That's a violation to our moral code. But let's say that stranger gets up immediately, is embarrassed, but is completely fine. Well, that makes the violation benign. And that benign violation, it makes you laugh. Another study, a Harvard research group did a study on tickling, and why do we laugh when we get tickled? So if you tickle yourself, what you'll see is you don't laugh very hard, because it's not a violation to tickle yourself. Now, if somebody else comes up and tickles you, that's a violation. And as long as it's not some crazy stranger tickling you, and it's somebody that maybe it's a benign violation. It's an okay violation, so you naturally laugh. And that's sort of where comedy comes from, is the violations of our moral code and the failures of the world. And comedians have a really great innate sense on how to articulate those violations and those failures to an audience, to help us sort of move past these hiccups of the world. So comedy and failure really it goes hand in hand. And what I've been able to do, because I've been so fascinated by this whole process, is I've sort of treated my comedy clubs as comedian laboratories. And I meet with my comedians once every couple months, and I'll record a focus group that we do with them, where we do experiments, we do personality tests, and we get deep down inside their minds to really dissect and have them divulge exactly what makes them them. And so we've really found fascinating things when it comes to the process of how comedians become funny. And so I want to walk through with you what the process is that they go through. We've sort of at this point found 6 principles or points that a comedian really does well at, in order to sort of deal with all the bad sides of what it takes to be a comedian. I know I could look at a lot of you, and you could say, if somebody forced you to go up and do stand-up comedy, that would maybe be on your top 5 lists of greatest fears, because there's really nothing more terrifying than failing in right in front of your peers. It's something that comedians deal with on a nightly basis, but in reality, it's something, especially as young professionals, that we deal with on a daily basis, as well as we grow as individuals, and we grow our businesses and our brands and our careers. So what we've really found with comedians is that they have an incredible innate ability to take and assess risk, right? Especially when it comes to their fear of facing failure. Because there's nothing worse, I'm going to tell you, there's nothing worse than when you get on stage and you bomb in front of everybody and nobody laughs at you and it's crickets. You want to get off stage and you literally want to hang yourself. I mean, it is one of the worst feelings that you could ever feel. So, what I want to do is I'm going to take you through these 6 principles, and I'm going to explain to you how a comedian deals with these principles to get better and to mature as a comic, and how then I'm going to break it down on how those principles sort of relate the same in the professional world, especially the young professional world. So the number one principle that comedians must have to even get started and to get on stage is self-confidence. And self-confidence, look, it's something that, for instance, I remember the first time that I performed stand-up comedy. I was 20 years old. I had a fake ID. I was performing on Hannibal Buress's open mic show. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that comedian, very successful comic now. And I went up there. I brought out all my friends, 20 to 30 people, and I was nervous as all hell. And I got up on stage. I was supposed to do about 5 minutes, and I think I did 20 minutes on my pet cat and barely got any laughs at all. And I remember feeling absolutely mortified, and my self-confidence was completely shot. And I said, I don't ever want to do this again. This was horrible. And what was so interesting is just by putting myself out there that one time, I remember the bar owner came and obviously didn't think I was very funny, but he loved that I had brought 30 people. And so in that instance, he offered me my own show to perform weekly. And I can't tell you how much that opportunity has completely changed my life. I wouldn't even be here talking to you if that had not happened. Now, I didn't do good. I failed miserably, but I had the self-confidence to put myself out there and to try something that I really, really cared about. And as simple as that sounds, that really is the beginning. Like I said, comedy is one of those things that absolutely feels frightening, but it's one of those things that when you get up, when you do it, when you keep doing it, it's something that you can progress and get better. But you can't get better at it if you don't get up and try. And so finding the self-confidence, it really, as cheesy as it sounds, if there's something you question yourself about, you just got to do it. You got to do it, and you got to fall flat on your face, and you got to get up and do it again. And so that's really the beginning principle. There's not a lot to it. Believe in yourself, get up on stage, and try again. And the same thing that comedians have to go through to do it, young professionals do. Do the same. If you have a new idea or a new business venture, or you want to put yourself out there in a way that you're unsure about, at the end of the day, nothing is going to happen if you don't at least try. And so that is really the first important principle to remember when it comes to sort of developing a leathered skin to dealing with the failure and the progression of your career. Another thing when it comes to self-confidence, a lot of things that stop us in self-confidence is perfectionism. We say to ourselves, or a comic will say, I don't want to try that joke right now because it's not perfect. And what happens is they end up never trying the joke. And what could have been a really great joke or becomes something good never happens because they get in their head that, it's just not good enough. It's not perfect enough. When in reality, that joke is only going to become perfect, or that idea is only going to become perfect if you get up there and you try it for the first time, because you're only going to make it better by learning through the failure you have to go through to get there, to make it better. So just a second, excuse me. So that sort of brings us to our second principle, and comedians, I think, especially artists, have an innate ability to do this, but it's something that they always have to work on because it feels very difficult, and that's to be vulnerable. And being vulnerable is usually, it's kind of a nasty word. To us, to a lot of people, it means weakness. If you're vulnerable, somebody could maybe come and harm you or take advantage of you. But in reality, vulnerability is sort of just the opposite of being too prideful. The moment you get too prideful as a comedian is the moment you give up the opportunity to get and to be funnier. And it's important to stay vulnerable as a comedian, and it's important to sort of take in the failures and criticism that can happen from being vulnerable, to learn and assess the data that you get um, um, from being vulnerable to be better. No comic in the world, can make a joke better if they're not vulnerable to listening to the critiques and the criticism it takes to make that joke better, to make that set better. For a comedian to get better, they have to take risks. And that favorite polished joke that you've ever heard from your favorite comedian, I guarantee it did not start as that joke. They had to go through trial and error, work a million different comedy clubs and open mics to get that joke to a level to where they're ready to present it on an album or present it in a format where you've seen it. Each time a comedian tries a new joke or tweaks a joke, they're taking a risk to make that joke better. They're being vulnerable to failure. They're opening themselves up to criticism. Somebody's not on mute here. Anyway, sorry. They open themselves up. They're being vulnerable. They know that this joke may not hit as well as they want, and they may get an awkward silence, and they may get judgment. They may get their friends afterwards to tell them, hey, that was horrible, or they may get tweeted at to say that joke went too far. And there's nothing worse than telling a joke and it falling flat and 200 eyes staring you back. But if they're not vulnerable to why that joke didn't work, well, then they're never going to be able to perfect that joke. They know in order to perfect that joke, they're going to have to take it on the chin. They're going to have to maybe get insulted. They're going to have to maybe take criticism. But after that, after they assess it, after they take the critiques, after they fail at the joke, after they bomb at it, after a while, after they make their adjustments, that joke gets perfected. And in the professional world, it's the same thing, right? Any new idea you have, or risk you want to take with your brand or with work, especially with things you care about, you naturally want to protect these things. You don't want to put them out in a way that makes them vulnerable. But in reality, it's in that vulnerability and it's in that failure that lie the answers to make it better. So being vulnerable, as scary as it sounds, is actually a really great thing. There's an awesome book by an author named Brene Brown called Daring Greatly. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do. She has a wonderful quote about vulnerability. She says, vulnerability is not knowing victory or defeat. It's engaging. It's being all in. Vulnerability is not weakness. So some examples of like what vulnerability maybe looks like, especially in the workplace, is it's trying something you're unsure of for the first time, or it's speaking up with a much different idea than everyone else in the room. It's putting out something you've worked really hard on and being able to take constructive criticism towards it. It's taking accountability for your mistakes. It's putting a joke out there and no one laughs. That's what vulnerability is. And so many times in the world, we try to run from vulnerability, especially when it comes to our professionalism, the front we're putting up, the thing we care about the most when it comes to our careers. It's so easy to get too prideful or too confident and really run away from vulnerability. But when you run towards vulnerability, when you assess the sort of the failure and the shame that comes from that vulnerability, that develops wisdom, and that develops a tough skin so that you can really learn how to become even better. Without vulnerability, a comedian or a professional cannot perfect themselves. So that sort of brings us to our next principle, and these two, vulnerability and this next one, sort of go hand in hand. And so for principle number 3, it's shame resilience, or being able to be resilient to embarrassment. One of the first things I noticed about comedians was they have an excellent ability to be resilient to shame and embarrassment. Not only can they tell a bad joke and be embarrassed by it and take the embarrassment, they can tell bad joke after bad joke after bad joke after bad joke, and then get up and go to another show and tell more bad jokes. You know, my favorite comedy to this day isn't the good comedy. I love going to the open mics we hold because it's as raw and as authentic of comedy as it gets. It's 90% not good, and it's so interesting to watch the process and the assessment that these newer comics have to go through and how they face the failure. I often don't see somebody that I think can be really good or really talented in the early stages from a good joke they tell. I can see how good they're going to become on their ability to be vulnerable and their ability to sort of plow through the shame and embarrassment that comes from putting yourself out there. And so, you know, comics, the ones that become great, they are just so good at not only being able to be resilient to that shame and embarrassment that comes from putting themselves out there, but also they're able to assess it. And so I'm telling you, when a comedian comes off stage and they've just bombed, they've just done a really bad set, they put themselves out there, nobody laughed, everybody thinks they're terrible. It's something that makes you sick to your stomach when you're a comedian. And it's something that you don't ever want to happen again. And you really can go two ways. You can sort of accept and be accountable to why your set didn't work, why the comedy didn't work, why that audience didn't laugh. You can dig in the shame, you can sit in it, you can keep going back to the shame and embarrassment of your bombing. And oftentimes the good ones do, and they reassess and then they adjust and they go up, and oftentimes they don't bomb again. And it's sort of the same analogy as a young professional. You've got to be able to not run from your shame and embarrassment from failures, especially being young. Making mistakes is a part of being young. And when you're leading, when you're starting businesses, when you're building a career, you know, that ability to be able to not run from your failure, not get over pride, not blame the audience, not blame everybody else, but look at yourself, look at your own shame, look at your own embarrassment, collect the data from where it came from, and you're able to adjust and take that and turn that into wisdom and success. So if a comedian isn't vulnerable, on top of if they're not able to sort of dissect through their shame and embarrassment on why things went wrong, they don't get better as a comedian. They just don't. It doesn't matter if there was one or two good jokes. To be a great comic, you've got to put a set of success together. And in order to do that, you've got to really maneuver and navigate shame and embarrassment. You cannot run from it. You've got to face your failures. You've got to look them in the eye, and you've got to adjust and progress. So that sort of brings us to the next principle, and it's a really important one, and one that I think we don't strategize enough with. But that's building a good support network. Too often did I find comedians, they would have a really good set or a really bad set. They would get off stage, and what does a support network look like to comedians? Well, it's the group that they surround themselves after they get off stage. And that group's responsibility is to be honest and hold the comedian accountable to their performance. Because when you're up there, when you're in the middle of your performance, when you're vulnerable, when you're putting yourself out there, you're not always the best judge of character to yourself. You're really not. So having a good support network, it's imperative. When comics got off stage and they had a bad support network, whether that was their group telling them, oh, it's the audience's fault. It's not your fault. And by the way, in comedy, you never blame the audience. If you're not funny, it's your fault. It's not the audience's fault. They're not tired. They're not conservative. They're not uptight. You just didn't adjust your empathy to understand the energy of that room. And so one of the most common, easy factors for comedians to not get better is that they blame their audiences. And what you'll see is if they surround themselves around a support network when they get off stage that also helps them blame that audience, it literally plateaus the comedian. And they could be the most talented comedian in the world. If they don't have the proper support that's being honest to them and saying, hey, you weren't funny there for this reason. Or you didn't do well there for this reason, or you did good there, but you could do better. If you don't have that support network holding you honest and holding you accountable, not only have I seen comedians plateau and never get better when they could have, if they were surrounded by the right people, sometimes they get too overconfident and too prideful, and they up and move to LA thinking they're going to be the next big thing, and you never even hear from them again. And I think that really relates in the professional atmosphere as well, because if you're not surrounding yourself with proper support that is making you honest, making you accountable, helping you through your shame resilience, helping you dissect your failures, helping you be vulnerable, being there to pick you up when you do fail, then you're going to plateau as a professional. It's important as professionals, especially young professionals, that we understand that this isn't the plateau, that we have so much more to learn. We have so many more mistakes to make. We have so many failures to assess. It really never stops. You get better at failing as you go on. Just like comedians, they get better at going in and changing a joke that doesn't work into one that does work quickly. You sort of learn to instead of chaotically fail, where it affects a ton of people and a ton of energy, you sort of fail up. And you learn that failure, it comes with success. And you sort of look forward to failing and putting yourself out there. Now, there's two major rules when it comes to failing. You don't really want to repeat the same failures over and over again, although sometimes we do. And you really don't want to hurt people. And that's one of our main rules in comedy is you can't punch down. You don't want to use your humor to hurt people, because there's something called too soon in comedy, where time has a lot to do with when and how people laugh. And so a comedian has to be a great assessor of time. And if they're too early on things, if they're not assessing it right, they can really fail bad. And the same thing goes in the professional atmosphere. It's about good support, and it's about good timing in a lot of things. So in the professional world, it's simple as this: if you surround yourself with a support network that is honest and helps you be accountable to be your best self, then you're going to have way more confidence and less fear when it comes to taking risks and being vulnerable. And you have to take risks and be vulnerable to keep growing and progressing. And when you are vulnerable, take a risk that maybe doesn't go as planned, you have a wonderful support system that can help you through that failure and will help you navigate it all. So comedians that have great support systems, even ones that maybe aren't that funny, progress so much quicker and so much better into becoming great comedians. It's something I watch consistently. So let's go on to principle 5. So the ability to know and communicate with their audiences. This one is really, really important, because at the end of the day, especially in these times, whether you're a comedian or a young professional, man, our country and our world is just split down the middle with their perspectives on things such as politics, religion, life in general. I can't think of a time that leadership in our politics has been more nasty, at least not in my life. So really having the ability to know and to how to articulate and to communicate. And really, we call it knowing your audience. And just because a comedian goes in with a specific joke or a specific set to one audience doesn't necessarily mean that's going to work in another audience. And you think of cultural differences. Audiences in Texas don't necessarily want to hear the same jokes as or presented in the same way as audiences in New York City. That's a pretty obvious one. But what I found is in watching comedians and studying them is that they have a great ability to translate their failures, which turn into jokes, into something that we can all laugh about. And the really good ones are able to sort of take those same jokes and communicate them to different audiences in different places at different times. They're sort of the only thing that I can think of on why they're so good at knowing their audience. They walk into a room for 20 minutes before they have to go up, and they're staring at everybody and what makes this audience what they are. And they've collected data over time, sort of emotional data from being vulnerable themselves on stage. Look, the best way to learn your audience is to fail with them. And so when you bomb on stage, whether you told a joke that is too soon or you went too far with it, or maybe that audience just didn't empathize with it, that's where you learn the most about other people and the empathy that exists in them. So unless you're out there failing, unless you're out there being vulnerable as a comedian, you're not really going to learn audiences. You're not going to learn that talent. And so what I see a lot of time is that the comedians that are less vulnerable typically will go into a comedy show treating the audience as if every audience is the same, and they come off prideful or arrogant with their set. Well, these jokes work everywhere else. Why wouldn't they work here? And they go into a setting like that and they completely bomb. And these are comedians that do well everywhere else because they didn't adjust to their audience. And typically that happens because it's a comedian that is unwilling to be vulnerable to their failures or to the criticisms of the past audiences. And so they just sort of skip that step, and they can really plateau as well. They felt so hard and so deep about their own failures and mistakes, and when they've assessed them in their shame, resilience, and embarrassment process, there's just so much that they've learned themselves that they're able to transcend any topic that would maybe make some people angry or some certain audiences angry, and they're able to make them laugh about it. And the only way they were able to do that is by going deep down into their own insecurities and their own failures instead of running away from those thoughts and sort of understanding how other audiences, other people, other comedians think. And I think the lesson here for young professionals is you have to try to understand how you communicate an idea you may have for your business or your career through different audiences. Just because you think you have a really good idea or it's something that for sure is going to work doesn't mean that your boss or your partner or your customer is going to translate it in the same way. And so if you follow those other principles, if you're vulnerable, if you're open to people's criticism, you become better at assessing how or when or in what style to pitch the thing that you really want to accomplish or get done. Because if you can learn how to communicate to a multitude of different perspectives, that's only going to help you be more successful in your brand or your company. So that brings us to the final principle, which is not rocket science. It's one of the oldest virtues that exists, but I think it's one of the most difficult, and that's patience. Being a young comedian or a young professional, the biggest thing that I think we we sort of long for is we want it all now. We want to be successful now. We want to be rich now. We want to be validated now. We want to prove ourselves right now. And in reality, if we don't go through the process of these principles, if we don't go through facing the fear of our failures, assessing our failures, making the adjustments, being vulnerable to criticism, able to handle shame and embarrassment, being able to communicate everything we've sort of learned from all this stuff to the different perspectives that exist, that takes time. I often tell my comedians that are just getting started, especially the ones that think they're the funniest things in the world, is that, man, this being good at comedy takes 10 years. And then you'll notice comedians like Jerry Seinfeld. There's a great documentary called Comedian, where basically he perfected a set. He went out and sold it. He got as successful as he could be in comedy. He got a sitcom from it, but he got tired of telling the same jokes. He got tired of telling the same comedic identity over and over again. And what that documentary does is it goes out and follows him, basically completely restarting. And that's sort of how it should be. If you perfect something, when you get to that point after all your hard work, you kind of tear it all down again and re-innovate and start it in a new way. And so, you know, for excuse me just a second. Look, true success at the end of the day, it takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. It takes a lot of physical and emotional sacrifice. And I think we get ahead of ourselves as young professionals, and we get very impatient, and we try to sort of control everything that we can in the moment, and sort of try to control the chaos. And that's very much what it feels like on stage as a comedian too. You're kind of walking into this world of chaos, and you don't know what to expect, and you're trying to control it all through your humor, and it doesn't go that way. But there's a great saying. It's called the Serenity Prayer that I often go through to help me be more patient. And it's to accept the things I can control and accept the things I cannot control, and to have the wisdom to know the difference. And look, there's some things now that are just not in your control. For instance, this pandemic. You know, we've been absolutely forced into a corner on how to handle this entire failure and this trauma that we're all going through. And you sort of have to sit down and go, wow, you know, I'm no longer in control of when I can open my business, when I can do work. And you sort of have to sit down and assess, well, what can I control in the moment? What can't I control? And, you know, what control, even if it's the tiniest thing, even if it's gardening for my sanity to help me stay sane to get back to work, that's the things you've got to figure out. And knowing the difference between what you can control and what you can't control, literally, to me, is the definition of helping you figure out your patience. Because if you're not patient, you get ahead of yourself, you get overwhelmed, and you can sort of create failures that you become prideful about, that are easy to just blame other people for. And you're not doing yourself any justice there. You always want to be accountable and vulnerable to your failures, because at the end of the day, that's where the answers lie. They are deep down in the darkness and the muck of your failures, and you've got to go down in there, get them, figure them out. Don't judge yourself too harshly, and sort of pull yourself out of the mud to perfect and to become a better professional. And as young professionals, that's something you're going to deal with on a daily basis, whether it's in your personal life or in your professional life. So look, you know, I've never spoken on this really before. This is something I've been working on. I know you guys wanted it to be a lot funnier, and if we were live and I had Barry there staring at me, hearing his laughs, it would probably be one of the funniest performances ever. And I hope to be able to come back to you again. It's really difficult to not be able to work off of your energy while we do these types of speeches. And I know this was a little disjointed, but I appreciate the time, guys. And I just want you to know, as a young professional, making mistakes is okay if you're accountable to them. In fact, those mistakes are going to build you a roadmap to your future successes. So I hope that all sort of made a little bit of sense there. I appreciate you taking the time. I think we're out of time. Were we supposed to do a Q&A at all? Justine, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. If anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
Kyle, shoot us one joke real quick. Give us your best one.
Oh my gosh.
It can be about Barry too. That's fine.
Hey.
Let me tell you a perfect example of a joke I learned from being vulnerable and taking the criticism from an audience member. So Chicago comedy, you know, there's a reason Chicago comedians are so well known and get so good at comedy, because they're literally performing in the back of bars while the Blackhawks game is on and everybody's drunk, not wanting to hear any jokes you tell. So you really got to earn the laughter. So I remember quite some time ago when I was performing, there was this guy sitting at the bar. The Blackhawks game was on. He literally looked like Barney from The Simpsons, the drunk fat guy at Moe's bar all the time. And nobody was laughing. And he looks up and it's complete silence. I'm bombing. He goes, "You look like Ellen DeGeneres." And I literally, it hurt my feelings at first, and I took the criticism back, and it ended up becoming one of my best bits. And so I used to open and do a self-deprecating bit for my set where I would come out and dance, and I would tell everybody in the room, just in case you were wondering, I am not Ellen DeGeneres, and it killed every single time. And that came from me being vulnerable to the failure of my set and listening to some drunk asshole who knows nothing about comedy give me one of the best joke lines I've ever had in my life. And by the way, I am not Ellen DeGeneres, so I'm not related to her. I don't care how much you think I look like her or our highlights in our hair are the same. We do both like women, though. I will give you that.
But you do look like her.
Shut up, Barry!
Kyle doesn't look like Barry's a picture of Ellen DeGeneres.
Oh, yeah. Well, Ellen, hopefully one day she'll bring me on her show, and her and I will do a funny bit. I think I'm more handsome than she is, but she's
No,
beautiful.
you're not. You're not.
Okay, next question.
What was it like working with Hannibal?
Oh man, so Hannibal and I are good friends, right? And I often brag about it. I started running comedy rooms when I was 20 in Chicago, and this was before social media. I think I maybe had a MySpace account, and it was really what I call the last generation of good comedians from that era. And I ran these comedy open mics in Chicago, and I helped cultivate Hannibal Buress, who was not funny at all forever. He was so awkward, and he finally found his comedic identity through years of failure. He ended up coming up with this joke where he talked about wanting to kick pigeons, because in Chicago, pigeons just come up on you like they own the place. And he's like, "You got wings and you're literally walking in front of me in my way." And so he had this great bit about kicking a pigeon, and just everybody in the Chicago community was like, yeah. And he found his voice, and he really took off from there. He wrote from SNL after that. And there was a great generation of comedians. It was TJ Miller, who's from, he plays that bartender character in, what's the movie with Ryan Reynolds, the superhero movie? Deadpool, yeah.
Deadpool.
Yeah, crazy blonde curly hair from Silicon Valley. And Kumail Nanjiani, who was just nominated for an Oscar for Big Sick. We were all just guys sitting in the backroom bars of Chicago, just failing miserably at comedy. And now we've all progressed to this level of comedic professionalism. I don't even know how it. Well, the principles we followed is how it happened. Putting yourself out there, failing, being vulnerable. And so it's so neat to see those guys be at the level they're at. And we're lucky enough where they come and drop in the club sometimes and catch up. But they're doing big theaters now and enjoying their fame. But great guys and gals nonetheless, really.
Kyle, can you remind everybody the book that you recommended?
Yes, it's called
About vulnerability.
Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. And I'm myself, the whole reason I'm even talking about this topic, and I really appreciate you guys hearing me out, is I myself, I'm trying to write a book. What I'm doing is I'm trying to build a school at the Comedy Bar in Chicago, and come up with these principles that my educators and my curriculum can come from. And for us, it's not necessarily about how to write a joke, although we have that too. It really is about how do you encompass being successful as a comedian? How do you encompass going through all this rigorous failure and still coming out on the other end with something so positive? William Shakespeare once said, "Life is but a stage." So it's so interesting to see that the transgression that these comedians and these transitions that these comedians go through to become great is just so much like the personal things we face in life to do well. So Brene Brown is a great inspiration. I would recommend all of her books on when it comes to dealing with the ickiness of sort of what it takes to become better.
What's happening at the club that we should go see?
Well, I do want to mention that. I want everybody to write this down. I'm giving the young professionals a 20% off promo code to use indefinitely at the Comedy Bar. You just type the word Dubuque into the promo code area when you're buying tickets, and you should be able to get 20% off. So this week we are we are bringing back all our open mics on Thursdays, which I'm most tickled about. Look, we don't make a lot of money on open mics. There's no ticket sales there really. But what's important is the comedy community, hell, the artistic community across the board has been decimated. I mean, you got to talk about these younger comedians that were working crap jobs, giving everything to their life, to their art, really trying to turn themselves into professional working. I mean, this comedy community has been decimated. They can't afford rent. So it's imperative for me to get these younger comics back and get them a platform and a voice to get back on stage after sitting there for 3 months. The thing about being an artist is you become rusty. And if you don't get up there and get working again, I fear that I will lose my comedy communities in these cities, and that will greatly affect the economics of my business. So, it is so imperative that we came up with a creative adjustment to get back in business. Look, we're at half capacity. We're doing comedy outside, which is terrible because comedy is very contagious with the laughter. There's a science to it. You really want to pack people in, but we're making the adjustments. We're getting comedians back on stage. We're doing what we have to. And to me, I read those statistics on the millennial generation. We are forged out of the fire of dysfunction and failure, our generation specifically. So it's going to be our generation that is going to lead us through the shit that is being thrown at us. By means no one's fault. I mean, this is failure that you couldn't control at all. And so those who get creative, those who are used to being able to deal and navigate and maneuver through failure are the ones that are going to innovate and be creative enough to not only adapt in today's business world, but thrive. And I think it's such a neat example of what the Comedy Bar is doing compared to all the other comedy clubs that is staying closed. And so, it's really neat that we always come from a place of failure, and I could have, put my head in my pants and said in my lap and said, let's stay closed. But because of where I've come from and how I built my company and the ability to adapt through failure, we're making money. This has been a little bit blessing of disguise, and we're the only ones open for business. So, we're having a great time. Also, Kristen Toomey is a headliner in Dubuque this weekend. She's absolutely one of my favorite comedians. I kid you not. She's got a filthy mouth on her. And she's on the pop-up on the patio in Dubuque this weekend. So I would suggest getting tickets, use that promo code. My wife's yelling at me. What? Oh, we will go inside if it rains. So Iowa is allowing us to go inside half capacity. The other cities are not yet. So there will be a show no matter what. Kristen is so funny, and we have to support each other. And everybody, I think that this young professionals thing is so neat. I talked about a support network and a support group. Well, this is a perfect example of that. You guys are all young professionals located in your community there. And I just think it is so neat that you're all supporting each other. You support each other's businesses. And this is the kind of thing that you're on the right trajectory for success. Okay, next question.
Hey, Kyle,
How do you sign up for Mike Night?
if you could find yourself a man's suit, you could actually say Ellen DeGeneres is appearing at your club, and you could.
Damn it, Barry! Off the Ellen bit now. Come on. Good Lord.
The other question.
Retired that bit years ago.
Nope, it's fresh, man. It's fresh.
If you pay me enough, Barry, I will do an Ellen DeGeneres dance for you at any time.
I'll buy you a drink.
I'm not ashamed. Okay, next question, not Barry.
I think someone had a question about how you get to be a part of the open mic night.
Oh, so right now it's a virtual sign up where you go comedybar.com/open mic and you're able to virtually sign up for it. But in the normal circumstances, which hopefully we'll be getting back there soon, you just show up a little bit early, sign up on the list. I recommend trying it, man. Even if you're not a comedian, open mics, there's nothing like the rush of getting on stage and just talking about your thoughts and feeling the judgment of others to sort of make you face the fear of failure faster.
All right.
Any other
Any other
questions, guys?
Well, Kyle, have you read the joke on Facebook? And I'm sorry if it offends anybody, but have you? I can't believe it is protest season already. I still have my COVID decorations up. Have you heard of that?
Or how about this one, Barry? Has everybody put on their COVID-19 talking about all the weight we've gained
Yes,
through this
I have.
whole thing?
I have done that.
Yes, I have too. But look, guys, we'll get through this, and I know we're out of time here. But just those principles, they're working theories and process. But facing your failures and being able to not be afraid of making mistakes and being judged for them. There's nothing more freeing when it comes to building yourself personally and professionally. Do not be afraid of failure. All your answers are there. Just don't go out failing to a point where you're hurting others. And that is the best advice I could give on life and being a professional.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, guys. And I hope to come back and do a live performance and something a little more funnier for the next time.
We do too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kyle.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
How do I close this?
Thank you.